Hi everyone. I'm a member of Platypus Affiliated Society in the London chapter. I'm going to kick off this teach-in with Clint by providing an account of the EU, which I draw from Michael Pettis and Matthew Klein's book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, from 2020. Clint will then critique my account. So first, I will describe the theoretical underpinnings of the book. So there's three of them. First is Hobson's concept of imperialism from 1902. Second is the balance of payments framework. And the third is their intuitions of anti-elitism. I'll also provide a cautionary word regarding the politics that are implicit in this book. So theoretically, the book takes up Hobson's concept of imperialism, under which different states compete to acquire markets to absorb their surplus capital. So in Hobson's time, right, the colonizers were the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Germans who exported their surplus goods to the colonies, which were Australia, Latin America, Canada, Africa, India, and China. The colonies pay for these foreign goods by absorbing foreign capital in the form of mounting levels of debt. In our time, the colonizers are the Chinese and the Germans prior to 2008, and the Chinese and the entire EU area after 2008. The colonized is principally the United States, a bafflingly inexhaustible dumping ground for the world's surplus goods and capital. So in this return to Hobson, the United States is actually the victim. We're the victim, not the victimizer. Okay, second, the book also relies on the balance of payments framework. So in this framework, when a country exports more goods than it imports, it runs a current account surplus, also called a trade surplus. And when it imports more goods than it exports, it runs a current account deficit. When a country exports more savings than it imports, it runs a financial account deficit. And when it imports more than it exports, it runs a financial account surplus. Accounts have to balance globally. So if there's a trade surplus in one place, it has to be balanced by a trade deficit somewhere else. So current account surplus countries can only exist insofar as there are also current account deficit countries. Colonizers must be paired with colonies. So that's the balance of payments framework. Lastly, the book draws from what I would roughly describe as a set of anti-elitist sensibilities. So here, absorbing trade surpluses, it hurts production, jobs, and workers in the deficit country, while absorbing foreign savings inflates asset prices, which benefits elites and asset owners in that country. So in other words, if we're saying America is being colonized by Germany and China, that helps German and Chinese industrial capitalists. It also helps American financial capitalists. Who does it hurt? It hurts American workers by depriving them of jobs, and it also hurts German and Chinese workers by depriving them of consumption. Thus, Pettis and Klein view trade imbalances as being sustained by class war that has been waged successfully on the part of elites in China, Germany, and America against the workers of all those three countries. So consequently, trade wars, trade restrictions initiated by a deficit country off the back of liberal democratic elections forms a kind of class resistance. So combined with countermeasures to these restrictions imposed on behalf of the elites in the surplus countries, we have trade war. So class wars are the secret to trade wars, which risk hot wars. Thus the title of their book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars. Okay, so that's where they're coming from. As for where they're going, let me just preface their historical account of the world's trade imbalances with their proposed remedies to them. They think that a European superbank and super government are needed to adjudicate Europe's trade imbalances, while the American state's fiscal and monetary scope should be expanded to adjudicate foreign dumping of capital. If I would put it uncharitably, the authors want post-neoliberalism to be about replacing a globalist flow of capital with a globalist administrative state. They want to replace, private elites, which are actually still accountable to markets, with public elites who are basically accountable with no one. So such an illiberal vision for post-neoliberalism, in my view, could be just as bad or not altogether different from the hot wars that they seek to avoid. So, let me just find my place. Okay, having shared their conceptual framework and their implicit politics, I will now summarize their account of German economic history, beginning with German reunification. So I'm going to tell this tale over 3 periods. The first period is how German reunification induced stagnation in Germany in the 1990s. The second period is how the German trade surplus emerged from the fiscal and monetary austerity coming out of the 2001 to 2004 recession. And then the third period is how this led to the Eurozone crisis and then the proliferation of German austerity throughout the rest of Europe after 2008. Okay, so we start with the first period. Set the stage, we're in the 1990s. So during the reunification of Germany, the German state set the exchange rate between East and West German Deutschmarks at 1-to-1. So the first thing that happened was the German state set the East German and West German exchange rate at 1-to-1, even though obviously at the time, West Germany is significantly more productive than East Germany, and the black market exchange rate would have been more 10-to-1. So 10 East German Deutschmarks to 1 West German Deutschmark. The second thing that happened is West German labor unions, they pushed for aggressive wage hikes in East Germany. Okay, so the first measure on the exchange rate, it made the East German workers completely unattractive for anybody to hire. And the second measure dooms the viability of East German firms, right? There's no way they can afford to pay their workers this much. So consequently, East German manufacturing output fell by 67% over 1989 to 1992. And by 1992, while East Germans were only 19% of the total German population, East Germans were 50% of the unemployed people in Germany. And those who could leave East Germany left East Germany. And they left behind in East Germany disproportionately uneducated men that were dependent on state benefits and intermediate work. Meanwhile, what was also happening is that there's 100 million East European workers coming online. There's 100 million East European workers coming into the global market. In 2000, the typical German manufacturing worker was earning 9 times as much as the typical Slovenian worker, right? So moving German operations to Eastern Europe becomes increasingly seamless as Eastern European countries were added to the EU starting in 1997. And between 1993 and 1997, German manufacturing employment fell by 15% as German firms moved disproportionately towards Eastern Europe, into Eastern Europe. During these years, Germany began to pursue a very restrictive monetary and fiscal policy. So over 1987 to 1992, the Bundesbank raised rates from 2.5% to 9% to combat a very modest creep up in inflation. And then over 1992 to 1998, the state cut infrastructure investments by nearly 20% as Germany fiscally retrenched in the Maastricht Treaty. From the early 90s to 1997, overall investment spending in Germany was basically flat. So those 3 conditions, the way in which we did reunification, what was happening with Eastern Europe, and then lastly, this German monetary and fiscal austerity, those are the 3 conditions coming out of reunification that led to the German stagnation in the 1990s. So over 1991 to 1996, reunified Germany only grew at a very sickly 1.3% compounded annual growth. So what's the reaction to this? In 1997, Roman Herzog proposes an explanation of and a solution to stagnation. He argued that Germans ask too much of their government and that cutting jobless benefits, lowering taxes, and lowering wages would be necessary to revitalize growth. In 1998, widespread disaffection with the German economy brought the SPD to power, with Schroeder at the helm of the state. But, as we will see 8 years later in 2005, Schroeder ended up implementing all of Herzog's proposals anyway. So here I'll just pause to say, I'm curious if people in the room know the leftist politics underneath the West German labor unions pushing for higher wages in East Germany. What was the kind of, ideology behind that? And I'm also curious about the political imagination behind Schroeder's bid for power against Herzog. Like, what was the rhetoric that the SPD was actually using in the 1998 moment? Okay. So we've just finished the 1990s period. Now we enter the second period. So the tech bubble in the United States bursts in 2001. And the bursting of the tech bubble plunges Germany from sickly stagnation in the 1990s to a deep recession. Now, the existence of the EU by this time meant that Germany could not lower their interest rates, since member states in the EU share a monetary policy. Consequently, in Germany, real rates were kept just as high during a horrific recession over 2001 to 2004 as they were during the short-lived boom of 1998 to 2000. And throughout the recession, the German federal, state, and local governments kept tightening their budgets relative to the start of the recession in 2001. So if you combine this nasty business downturn with punishing monetary and fiscal austerity, together the result was that we significantly depressed domestic spending in Germany. So over 2000 to 2005, business investment net of depreciation, so new money being put in by businesses into Germany, they fell by 60%, while 2 million full-time jobs vanished from Germany. Real domestic demand fell 3% over 2000 to 2004. And this is remarkable. Despite there being inflation punctuated by rising oil prices, Germans actually spent fewer euros on imported goods and services in 2004 versus 2000. And foreign spending on German exports as a result rose by more than German spending on imports, which produced a massive massive shift in Germany's current account balance. So what I really want to emphasize here is that this moment of depression in consumption, not any explosive growth in production, but depression of consumption, that's the secret origin of the German surplus, right? That 10 years later, all these mainstream politicians will say is a good thing. So what was the German political response to this abysmal set of conditions? In February 2002, Schroeder goes to his friend Peter Hartz to lead a commission to make suggestions on how to boost employment. Who is Peter Hartz? He is like the head of human resources at Volkswagen. And he comes up with a brilliant idea. He says, hey, we can increase the number of jobs in Germany simply by reducing the pay per job. Okay? And then in August of 2002, the Hartz Commission published a report arguing that Germans choose to remain unemployed or retire early because of government handouts. And the solution to that, naturally, is to cut benefits. So on the back of the Hartz Commission in March of 2003, Schroeder proposed the Agenda 2010, which was a policy copy of Herzog's plan from 1997. So under Agenda 2010, the welfare state would be restructured and individual responsibility would trump collective provision. There were mass protests in Germany in 2004. However, they proved insufficient to reverse the agenda. So in January 2005, Hartz IV was implemented, slashing unemployment insurance, raising the retirement age, and penalizing Germans that rejected jobs for too little pay. Discontent with Hartz IV and the general German economic situation brought a new government to power, the CDU-led coalition under Angela Merkel. But it was not enough to overturn the measures that the new government proceeded to preserve and to execute. And in Clint's section in our group discussion, we should return to this 2004 moment in Germany and consider why this moment, was or was not an opportunity for leftist politics. So now we enter the third period. So the results of the prior period were basically to suppress domestic consumption and domestic investment, along with seeing an explosion in economic inequality. So over 2005 to 2015, the percentage of Germans considered to be at risk of poverty doubled. The percentage of German jobs that are part-time versus full-time have also doubled since the 1990s. And since 1998, government capex, right, this is government spending on infrastructure, projects, whatever, has not even been enough to maintain the existing infrastructure. About half the roads and bridges in Germany are in desperate need of repair, and the Leverkusen Bridge that crosses the Rhine between Cologne and Düsseldorf was closed to trucks in 2012 because it was no longer safe for heavy vehicles. Meanwhile, German economic inequality also exploded. So if we're in a closed economy, firms cutting wages across the board, that would hurt overall demand for the goods that they sell. But in Germany, widespread wage cuts did not hurt businesses because German firms could export their goods, right? So they were able to cut costs while sustaining revenues, which led to profit growth over the 2000s. If German households had all owned corporations, and these corporations distributed their higher profitability through dividends and share repurchases, then the wealth earned from all these exports could have trickled down across Germany. But in Germany, only 10% of German households directly own shares in listed companies. And moreover, 90% of all businesses in Germany, accounting for more than half of all corporate cash flow, are family owned by just 10% of German households. The average German is about as wealthy as the average Spaniard. But the median German is much poorer than the median Spaniard. And the median German is only about as wealthy as the median Greek or Polish household. So to the casual observer, it is wild that, the German people endured all of this seemingly without complaint. And there is an outstanding question of what in mass ideology or mass psychology is justifying and perpetuating tolerance of these circumstances, right? This begs the question of politics, the death of the left, and in general, like what is going on amongst the masses. But for now, let us just say that the German workers did not suffer alone. Their suffering would quickly be extrapolated to the rest of European workers. And how? Okay, so now we'll use our balance of payments framework that we introduced earlier. So it was only possible for Germany to export vastly more than they imported, and therefore to accumulate significantly more savings than they used, if other countries simultaneously imported vastly more than they exported and absorbed significantly more capital than they saved. So more than 25% of the value generated by German labor and capital was exported prior to 2008. And where did it go? Mostly to the rest of Europe. So German underspending accumulated as surplus income that went toward acquiring foreign financial assets, which supported further foreign demand for German exports. Over 2002 to 2008, German households spent 700 billion euros less than they earned. This net financial outflow was the result of Germans buying 2.7 trillion euros of assets abroad, while foreigners only bought 2 trillion euros of assets in Germany. And if we look at the 2.7 trillion of euros of Germans buying assets abroad, 1.6 trillion was German banks buying bonds and lending abroad, nearly half of which came from the state-owned Landesbanken. A huge portion of the lending went to what would become the Euro crisis countries. So from 2002 to 2008, lending to foreigners ballooned. Spain went from 250 billion euros of net obligations owed abroad to 900 billion. Portugal went from 160 billion to 340 billion. Greece went from 100 billion to 330 billion, while Ireland went from 450 billion to 1.8 trillion. Collectively, what would become the Euro crisis countries took out 4 trillion euros of foreign debt over 2001 to 2008, while their current account balance more than tripled from a deficit of 2% to a deficit of 7%. So the Euro crisis countries, kind of like the colonies of old, took on a punishing amount of debt to pay for foreign imports. And this led directly to the Eurozone crisis. So the crisis countries that absorbed excessively cheap capital plowed it into, as we would expect, low returning projects. I should pause here to insert that a Widerspiegelung, yes, of what happened in Europe played out in America. So Chinese and European capital dumped into the United States, combined with fiscal policy subsidizing home ownership, packaged into complex financial products by Wall Street, led the American household sector to incur a punishing and toxic level of debt to pay for homes that they couldn't afford. The loans for these homes ended up on the balance sheets of systematically important financial institutions like banks and insurance companies, and concerns about the viability of these assets led to a bank run, a run on those institutions, which led to the global financial crisis of 2008, with devastating consequences for American households. Okay, so instead of considering that the Eurozone crisis was coming out of the German surplus model to begin with, the outcome of the Euro crisis is that the entire Euro area agreed to adopt the German surplus model. So it's like the German surplus model breaks the EU, and coming out of the crisis, all the other countries agree to adopt the German model. In my view, this was a contingency rather than a necessity. Actually, I will leave it to Clint to try to unpack why Greece didn't leave the EU and we didn't make more of this opportunity. So from either way, this is what happened. And then from 2011 to 2012, severe contraction in domestic spending and investment as a result of the business downturn and government cuts generated substantial trade surpluses across Europe, including in the crisis countries. So over 2008 to 2016, the combined current account balance of the crisis countries shifted from a deficit of 6.5% of their GDP to a surplus of 2% of their GDP. Underneath the surface, right, of all these crisis countries rebalancing to become more like Germany, underneath the surface was a brutal picture of, cutting people and their economies to the bone, with real domestic spending on consumption and investment plunging 11% in Spain, 9% in Italy and Portugal, 14% in Cyprus, 13% in Slovenia, and 33% in Greece. Real consumption and investment in many of these countries remains below their pre-crisis levels to this day, while Greece obviously remained in depression for years. The most significant consequence of the decision to adopt the German model starting in 2012, which was, of course, affirmed by all the political failures to resist this, have produced a situation in Europe where Europe, as a net surplus region, is even more sensitive to a change in Chinese demand and Chinese supply than ever before. And this will matter a great deal, I think, in the coming months and years. So that's a kind of recap of what the authors say on Germany. And I will give a very brief account on what they say about China in order to introduce, why China could pose such a great threat to Europe in the coming years, especially in light of American policy since 2018. So I'm happy to go into more details, but basically in brief, while the European trade surplus was engineered largely by, as we discussed, suppressing domestic investment and spending, the Chinese trade surplus was engineered by keeping Chinese exports artificially attractive. And this was done through basically a five-pronged approach, which, only worked because they had all five prongs. The first one was the state suppressing the value of the Chinese currency, which depressed the purchasing power of Chinese workers for foreign goods. The second is foreign reserve accumulation by the state. The third is the state's suppression of workers' ability to combine and bargain for higher wages. The fourth is the state's financial repression of the Chinese household sector. And the fifth is very regressive taxation in China. And for many reasons that I won't go into now, but starting with the fact that the American people, took a stand in 2016, right, saying they refused to tolerate the whole situation, this paradigm that we've described any further, which brought Trump, Peter Navarro, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, so that part of the Trump administration to power. This model, this Chinese model is hitting a wall. And I will permit me a brief polemical interlude that, I think based on this approach, when the American people sort of put the wheels in motion behind the trade wars, they weren't actually screwing over workers in Germany or China or anywhere else, because those workers were already being screwed over. So now I will fill in what has happened since the book was published in 2020. So since reopening from COVID last year, the recovery in Chinese domestic consumption has been extremely poor. Meanwhile, so Chinese consumption has yet to really recover. Meanwhile, they have maintained very high levels of production to meet predetermined GDP targets and sustain employment. So instead of adopting the measures that in China would reduce production, redistribute economics, things that would hurt industrial elites and help workers, they have decided to simply grow the gap between production and consumption. And that means China is generating a rising amount of excess capacity across autos, renewables, consumer goods, and more. And since the US is increasingly unavailable as the dumping ground for Chinese exports since 2018, and that will continue, I think, whether it's under Biden or Trump, Europe has become the only market that is large enough and rich enough to absorb this growing tsunami of Chinese goods. And in 2024, I think Chinese excess capacity will be a growing economic pain for Europe, and one that is already splitting apart the EU. So on the one hand, countries like Hungary and Serbia, and I think more recently Germany, are apparently electing to cooperate with China. So they would rather hold on to their share of Chinese exports and accept Chinese investment and jobs created by Chinese investment in their countries, even if that means providing a conduit for China to export and dump its capacity all over Europe, as well as risking intellectual property transfer to the Chinese. Meanwhile, countries like France seem to continue to stand against China. So, in this kind of situation, EU-level trade decisions will likely become increasingly confused and lack credibility as a result, because Germany and France, as the two most important countries, are not cooperating on trade. Ultimately, perhaps Chinese excess capacity will be like a final nail in the EU coffin, and countries will either accept, will either move towards becoming tributaries of the Chinese economic empire and or try to convert the rest of Europe into their new dumping ground to replace the US, just as China is trying to fill the hole left by the US dumping ground with Europe. Okay, and so, so now I'll just quickly summarize two of the positive lessons I got from the book and a couple of the negative lessons from the book, which Clint will critique from the left and provide a subjective and political perspective on. So on the positive side, I think the book does do a good job of showing how neoliberalism did not succeed even on its own terms, in terms of one, shrinking government power, and two, boosting or maximizing consumption. So less welfare and more consumption in the US actually required increasing government power and repressing consumption in the surplus countries, namely Germany and China. The free movement of capital did enable, the free movement of capital actually enabled internal imbalances to be immediately externalized. So perversely, it allowed American financiers, German industrialists, Chinese industrialists, Greek ship owners, and whoever, to combine, however unconsciously, even as neoliberalism worked to undermine prior American and Soviet industrial capitalist combinations. The second lesson is, I think, that when we see mainstream politics that seek to increase domestic investment in the deficit countries or to increase domestic consumption and government spending in the surplus countries, those politics are neither left-wing or right-wing fascism, but they're kind of natural calls to save capitalism from itself. So when they're coming from former leftists that are now posing themselves as post-left or adopting nominally right-wing policy platforms, this is just individuals kind of crawling out of the corpse of the leftist organizations that they were in to try to make their bid to participate in the reconstitution of capitalism. And I don't think we should misrecognize them for more or less than that. In terms of the negative side of the lessons to draw from the book, while Lenin could provide an eminently dialectical critique of Hobson, who was against imperialism as a liberal progressive, and of Hilferding, who saw a directly progressive aspect of it as a social democrat, we are, like this whole discussion, we are working with a very degraded notion of imperialism compared to Lenin's notion of imperialism. Because we're conceiving of imperialism here as like a mere colonizer, colony, trade, and, elites versus workers sort of paradigm. Lenin's imperialism involves social democracy, right? The social democratic movement as an objective factor that we lack, thus a standpoint that we lack. And Pettis and Klein obviously have no clue about this. Second, Pettis and Klein don't have a concept that workers don't just produce goods, but they also produce society. So they can't pose the question, why did the workers that were constituted in neoliberalism, in Eastern Europe, in China, wherever, why did the workers that were constituted in neoliberalism in the surplus countries, why did they not constitute themselves as a class, as an objective factor, right? And that has to do with the death of the left. And lastly, Pettis and Klein show how the establishment impulse of post-neoliberalism is, I think, tending in their proposals about what to do in Europe, what to do in China, what to do in the US. Their proposals kind of give you this picture of them wanting to move towards a globalist administrative technocracy, which is not a break from, but actually a continuation with the worst parts of neoliberalism. So if we consider the hypothesis that Blaine proposed yesterday, which is that, one of the hypotheses, which is that we missed the opportunity already to intervene in the crisis of neoliberalism from the left prior to 2008, if that's the case, then the reconstitution of capitalism and post-neoliberalism will obviously come from the right. And this is the case whether it comes from nominally right people, the individuals that were formerly nominally leftist but have now declared themselves to be post-leftist, or if it comes from mainstream politicians. The proposal at hand appears to be an expansion of authoritarian state power, which will further subjugate social potential. Post-neoliberalism, then, would perpetuate how neoliberalism naturalized the victory of progressive liberalism in the early 20th century over society, while breaking with the promise that neoliberalism had to break with a half century of social subjugation that preceded it. Finally, I would just tentatively hypothesize that perhaps this is one reason why leftists like Benjamin Studebaker have sought to criticize Platypus for how we take up the Enlightenment. Perhaps it's our defense of the mere concept of society that seems to be most at peril in this moment. Clint.
So Klein and Pettis take up Hobson very self-explicitly. They are thinking that they're the first ones to discover that this guy, J.A. Hobson, wrote this book that is actually explaining everything about trade imbalances, colonies colonizing, that is making sense of what's actually happening in the crisis of 2016 to 2020 politically, the trade wars, right? In short, the German and Chinese industrialists suppress their own workers' consumption in order to dump that product onto the American workers, courtesy of American finance, okay? This sort of thesis is shared by left-leaning liberal economists to whom many on the left looked to for guidance, like Adam Tooze or Yanis Varoufakis. To this sort of thesis, right, that basically World War II to 1972, the U.S. is a surplus country. It's the one exporting capital and goods to the whole world. And then after 1972, it basically becomes a deficit country. It is now absorbing the world's goods and absorbing the world's capital, okay, which is what we should get to in detail with this 90s to 2016 moment. So because Varoufakis was the finance minister under Syriza's aborted challenge to Berlin-Brussels austerity, and who later theorized the common left populist organizational efforts seen first in Podemos, and that later expanded into Democracy in Europe 25, it's worth to take a brief look at the historical obstacles that impeded conceiving not European democracy, but society in Europe, and therefore the potential and need for politics. As with much of the millennial left, there was a reversal of means and ends. Just as Jacobin magazine thought Bernie's electoral hijack of the Democratic Party would then sow conditions for a mass socialist party, when in fact their goal of socialism became the means of their subordination to Biden, a reversal of means and ends seems to have been at play in the left's political orientation to the EU. Okay, so Bernie-crats, Corbynistas, etc., let's pressure the Democratic Party in order to get socialism. But really what that means is we're using socialism in order to subordinate ourselves to the Democratic Party. Same sort of thing in terms of the political orientation to the EU. The idea was, first, the supranational technocratic EU needs to be democratized. Then the working class can organize its social capacity to exercise political power in some way. So everything is about how do we democratize the EU, at least in the first phase. Okay? How the EU was to be democratized was, of course, the problem that exercised and divided the left. In November 2015, right after, as Jens Wissel and Nikos Nikisanis put it on the Platypus panel hosted then, Alexander Tsipras of Syriza, quote, obliged the European leadership to shoot him in public. These different left perspectives, each the result of their own shard of the 20th century, came into conversation. So they've got 4 people on this panel that is being hosted in Frankfurt in like a month or so after, as they put it, Alexander Tsipras, Syriza forces them to shoot him in public, right? Okay, we're going to get into what that means and the actual strategy that was coming out there. So Jens Wissel, he's like a Foucauldian radical reformist. We had somebody, Juan Roch from Podemos, which has just been founded. We had Nikos from an organization that was associated with Syriza and then broke with Syriza after the public execution, right? And then Martin Sukenecht, who is a Trotskyist, Gruppe Arbeitermacht in Germany. So these 4 are kind of coming into conversation. So Jens Wissel, who seemed to align himself with the speaker from the recently founded Podemos, Juan Roch. They're arguing for a direct appeal to the common sense of the popular classes. So while Wissel and Roch both sought civil social associations, democratic demands against corruption, small resistances, and ultimately parliamentary disobedience in order to reform the EU from within, for the Foucauldian Wissel, transforming the anti-democratic neoliberal terrain of the EU would only usher in a new form of capitalism. And this new form of capitalism would not yet solve, quote, social inequalities, climate change, racism, and sexism. Juan Roch of Podemos was much more explicit that democratizing the EU meant posing the people against the elites, the Leclau-Moff format that would come to define the stillborn attempt by the millennials to move from protest to politics in the form of left populism. Okay, so Jens, he's saying we need to democratize the EU through these like small radical reformist struggles in order to bring in a new form of capitalism that is not yet going to solve the key issues, meaning that the real problems with capitalism are climate change, racism, sexism, and social inequality. Juan Roch of Podemos is not quite saying that. He's saying there's the people and the elites, right? So we need to marshal the people against the elites, and looking for a much broader sort of like base for that. Okay. So, and what Juan of Podemos is saying is that we're moving beyond left and right. Okay. So the Foucauldian and the left populists nevertheless seem to stand over against Nikos from Syriza and Martin Sukenecht, the Trotskyist. So the Sukenecht, the Trotskyist, is calling for a revolutionary politics for a socialist United States of Europe. Okay? So this is pretty like, so Jens and Podemos do not like this idea, right? You don't want to have this revolutionary party and this revolutionary rhetoric, because this is not going to actually galvanize people, okay? And of course, you know, for the Foucauldian, you're going to reproduce, you know, Leninist, Stalinist, authoritarian, hierarchical parties, okay? Nikos is sympathetic to the idea of a revolutionary socialist United States of Europe. He says, great idea. But he's actually admitting something a bit more interesting. Nikos admitted on the panel that perhaps Brexit a year before, in 2014, so Greece exiting the EU, would not have been in the cards. But now, in November 2015, he thought Greece leaving the EU was a better play. After all, Angela Merkel and Obama did outplay him and Syriza. They waited for the left populist party to play their full hand in Syriza. A more reasonable deal was possible if Syriza was not driving the hard bargain. So in that year, we had somebody named Tio Valisaris, who's a platypus member in Greece, and he's basically saying, look, if we want a deal to Syriza, right, if you want a deal, then argue on those terms, right? Don't say, we're going to leave the EU, and then not do it, okay? So basically what the play that Berlin, Brussels, that Merkel is able to do with Syriza is that Syriza plays the full leftist populist card. If we don't reduce the debt burden in this austerity package, then we are going to leave the EU. And on the exact day that they get the mandate, they held a referendum, Syriza gets the mandate, the left populist mandate, right? We are ready to leave the EU if we don't get our terms. Tsipras comes back and says, okay, actually, we've capitulated, and to worse terms, okay? So like several more lifetimes of debt, okay? So Yanis Varoufakis is saying like this will never be paid off. Like it's not the thing that's going to be paid off within lifetimes, okay? So in that sense, because now that left populist card has already been played because Podemos, Italy, Ireland are looking at what's just been happened to Greece, and so now nobody's going to play the card. All right? So what could have they done during that time? This is what they're talking about on the panel, but not really able to actually conceptualize, well, why didn't Syriza try to build some sort of bloc with Italy, Spain, Ireland? Okay? Why was there no appeal to the German working class? Okay? So there's several, like, antinomies on this panel. Obviously, there's the party and movement. You know, Suchanek is saying, well, we need a party in order to have, that it's guided by a revolutionary United States of Europe. Podemos and the Foucauldian are saying, well, all we need to do is have these, like, small base movements. Syriza is obviously a party. Nationalism and internationalism, okay? The supranational technocratic EU versus localist organizing, national organizing, okay? And these are not really able to fully coalesce by 2015. So why? So the fact that there is no. So this is where. So now let's see what Nikos' answer to that is.
From the perspective of Syriza itself,
right?
Syriza was never committed to leaving the EU because they had an ideological commitment to the EU itself.
So here's Nikos.
They just had to make it a compelling, credible threat, which they did. They failed to do.
They didn't propagandize to the masses of Greece, saying like, "Look, this is not going to be total disaster if we actually leave," right? They didn't try to build connections with the other ones.
With Italy, Portugal, right, Spain, they could have all coordinated to present a credible threat to Merkel to leave the EU, which they did not.
And it is actually also kind of based on some of the conversations last night that I'm going to quote what Nikos says on the panel about why they couldn't actually leave. Right? This was not a credible threat, and there was not actually an imagination of leaving the EU, which of course Berlin and Brussels knew.
Yeah. That's why Merkel could call their bluff.
Right? And that's what Tio is saying leading up to this, saying like, don't play this game. Like, you can actually negotiate a good deal, all right, on a non-national basis, right? Because Syriza is joining with the far-right party, right? To say like, okay, we're going to support the Greek nation, right? So here's Nikos. He says that the Greeks tried to be more European by staying in the EU and having a showdown with Merkel in Brussels. All right, quote, "We cannot easily denounce this strategy in general. It has been proven very useful and quite crucial. If the left decided to renounce and contravene all dominant values at once, it would certainly be marginalized. Nevertheless, when the social movements recite the dominant ideology, this puts them on hostile and slippery ground. Accepting the dominant values and employing them against the dominant classes may make for a useful weapon, but it may also capture political movements for the dominant ideology." The dominant ideology being Europe. Okay? This is exactly what happened to Syriza. The party failed to defend Europe to the extent that it couldn't imagine a future outside the Eurozone. Okay? This caused Syriza to reject its own policy and accept the austerity memorandum, to surrender and submit to neoliberal European leadership. So there comes a point at which the left cannot remain attached to the dominant values of Europe without undermining itself. For Greece, that moment came in July 2015. It is old news now that there is only one Europe, and we have to decide if we are going to stay within it, accepting these dominant values, policies, treaties, or whatnot. And then, of course, a year later, Brexit. Okay? And so we hosted a panel. So the London chapter hosts a panel between basically somebody around Spiked Magazine who was arguing for Brexit as a left exit. And then you had somebody associated with the Fifth International, but like a labor, in and out of the Labour Party, who was saying definitely remain. And then Mike McNair of the CPGB calling for a boycott of the election. Okay? And when you look at each of their perspectives by themselves, they are internally coherent. But when you see all three of them together, you can the things kind of fall apart. So, what is the Brexiteer, the Lexit, okay, which will then become a strategy after this, discussed by the left, for the rest of the European countries? So Syriza doesn't do it. Britain does it, but from the right. And now, that becomes a sort of talking point after that. So, what is Neil Davenport was his name, but what is he saying? The Brexiteer, the Lexit guy. This is going to open up the possibilities of popular democracy, popular sovereignty. Okay, this is going to open up new discussions. All right. What is the Remainer saying? That Brexit is just going to instill racism in the British working class. That the effect of this is going to be that UKIP is going to take charge of the United Kingdom. Okay? And then Mike McNair in the middle is saying, well, actually, this is just a crisis within the Tory party. And I would support Remain if a full Brexit were to happen, meaning that Nigel Farage comes to become the prime minister and UK is pulled out of American capital markets. So, like, in a way...
It's what, European capital markets? No,
American. Right? Because that's what the full implication would have, according to McNair in that moment. Mm-hmm. All right? Because the idea is, and we can talk about what the different, but like, which is like, I don't think it's true, but like, because he says it's the U.S. forcing the UK to enter the Eurozone or the European Union.
Obama writes an op-ed, I think, in The Guardian, telling the British they should remain. And Jamie Dimon comes in and does a whole town hall saying
Yes.
they should remain.
Right.
Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan.
So like, I don't think it's like, so basically but basically that the U.S. forces the UK into the EU so that it can control the EU, preventing it from becoming an imperial power. I don't think that's really right, because there's mass democratic support for entering the EU in Britain in the 70s. Y'all know Britain has only ever had 2 national referenda, like the people vote, and that's decided as like a course of national policy. And one was in 1975 to enter the EU, and the second one was in 2016 to leave the EU. Okay, those are the only 2 national referenda. Okay, so basically after Brexit, right? Is this going? So does this mean that it's going to Brexit is going to fall to the right, and that this is going to be forcing the racism of the working class, or the other guy saying, you obviously don't trust the workers that you pretend to represent. You think that they're just going to do all of this sort of stuff when you're pretending to lead the workers. So popular sovereignty or anti-racist class consciousness is basically how the terms, were being played out, in that left exit. There's a lot of other stuff that we can sort of bring out as well. So basically after that, the sort of 3 positions that kind of taking up this sort of, once the austerity model is beginning to be exported, the left kind of says we either want more Europe, so increasing the institutional protections, reforming the EU from within, or you can have Lexit, leaving the EU per se, and then what Podemos and Yanis Varoufakis were trying to do, which is civil disobedience within the EU. All right, so staying within the EU, but trying to resist it from within, and not accepting any of its terms, but staying within it. Okay, so the point that I'm making here is that this question of democratizing the EU without conceiving what is the social question that the EU is responding to is what's allowing this to all be half backwards. Okay, so it's not a consideration of what would the potentials of Greek society have been had they courted out on their own, right? And now they're going to have to make appeals to the US, to China, right? There's going to be all kinds of, where it's taking that risk in the name of some sort of social potential, okay? That's actually what's handicapping a lot of the discussion in that moment, that the politics is not informed by some sort of vision of society, okay? And that we can see this really in the trajectory of Yanis Varoufakis. So basically he goes from his book, The Global Minotaur, which is kind of his version of the global recycling of surplus, that the U.S. is playing this recycling role since the 70s. And with that, the idea of the Green New Deal, right? So the Green New Deal is kind of the frame within which a more federated European Union, or a more democratic, whether politically or economically democratic European Union, that's sort of the framework within which that project is initially conceived. And I would argue that a progressive liberal New Deal is also eclipsing the question of society. Okay, and that we can get to the deeper ramifications of that. But then this very much becomes clear in where Varoufakis has ended up in his new book. So we basically go from global minotaur recycling surpluses. Therefore, we need a New Deal at a global level, because the first one was at a global level too, to techno-feudalism. Okay? So that's kind of, and so like we're basically saying it's not even capitalism anymore. Okay? And what is he pointing to there? He's saying that there's no more market-driven profit. We're not actually exploiting labor for profit. Instead, it's central bank stimulus propping up a labor economy. And then secondly, that these huge platforms like Amazon, whatever, their profits are not actually due to a market, but more like a fief. Basically because, so what's at stake in those two claims, or like that basic idea of why it's feudalism, not capitalism? What's at stake there is that we can't actually imagine the role of capital as the self-contradiction of labor. Okay, we can't imagine society. Okay? So, like, if there's no, let's put it this way, if there's no new businesses in Europe, then maybe it is all just government surplus, government stimulus. Right? And maybe that, if there may be the exploitation of labor isn't the right way to conceive the post-neoliberal European technocratic austerity, right? So what I'm pointing to there is that this inability to conceive the social question and focusing everything on democracy has actually kind of reversed the means and ends for the way that the left was approaching the politics of the Eurozone crisis. But there's a lot packed in there, and there's a lot that we could unfold further that I'm probably presupposing, but not making explicit. So let's open it up to what is like the economic, political, 1990s, early 2000s, leading to the Eurozone crisis, like what's actually going on there. And then the politics of the left populist moment, which I'm arguing was stillborn before it became something.
Well, you could make a case that really this stillbirth of the left populism was preconditioned by, well, the ideological obstacles the left put on itself, in a sense that, really to speak of society and like the Greek people or the Italian people, or the British people voting for something and like actually having it delivered to them, really became kind of right wing giveaways, right? That had completely abdicated any sort of responsibility for that in favor for technocratic management and complete distrust of ostensible democracy, but actually deep distrust of demos.
Right.
And I mean, it was almost inconceivable, aside from Spike in the UK, who were, kind of ostracized. It was almost impossible to talk about Brexit in the ostensibly leftist circles.
Right.
And I think what should be pointed out with progressive Brexit as well is that it was a crisis of both parties.
Of Labour?
Yeah, of course. Corbyn was on the fence about Brexit.
Right.
As in, it was the traditional Labour voters of the industrial communities of Northern England that voted for Brexit because their communities were completely overrun by cheap labour for Eastern Europe, right? And why were they against it? Because they're racist,
right? Against
Eastern Europeans, and
right.
And so the resistance was both in Labour and in Tories. It's not really the case that it's there.
Why did Cameron call the referendum? Do you remember why?
Well, his bet was he was attempting to get a better deal out of the EU.
It was basically I feel like it's all linked to austerity, right? Because he wins in 2010, and it's a very close election. So much so that it's a hung parliament, and he does the deal with the Lib Dems. In 2015, to keep the party together, he has to promise in the Tory referendum or a manifesto that he's going to call this thing. Now, his view is, again, much like the Syriza guy, this is just a negotiating tactic against Merkel.
Right.
And he goes to Merkel and says, let's just make these changes, and then I'm sure I can sell this to the people. And she's like, no. No, we're not making any changes. You've seen the problem that everyone has to adopt our system. And so both of it is both the votes are anti-austerity, but no one's willing to take them on those terms, right? Neither Syriza is willing to accept that Greece can exist outside of this anti-austerity thing. It's more like, let's just get a slightly better deal. Let's a little less austerity, please. And Britain's like, maybe we can have a little less austerity, maybe we have a little bit more freedom to do things, maybe we can take a little less Eastern European labor than before. And so it feels like that, they're both come out of that anti-austerity moment, which the left does take up initially, but then seems to reject when it's like the people actually are demanding.
Once the people actually enter, then,
Yeah.
then the left
Then
comes
it
to
becomes
defend the
dirty.
EU.
Yeah, then it becomes like some dirty thing. So
I have a comparison question. Can you further elaborate on what way the German surplus model was adopted by the other countries?
Oh, yeah. So coming out of the 2012 moment, essentially what the other countries end up doing is they end up cutting a huge amount of government spending. So domestic investment is going down. At the same time, they're not able to actually stimulate or themselves out of the horrendous business downturn. So the business environment continues to be bad, right? Household disposable income in real terms continues to fall. So as domestic consumption and domestic investment, both private and public, as those things get cut and keep going down, right? That's how in the crisis countries, they go from being deficit to surplus, because now they're producing more than they consume. Whereas before they were consuming more than they produce, and they're borrowing a lot more than they save, and now they're saving about as much as they borrow or a little bit more.
And that
Yeah.
happens in the same way in the whole EU?
That model gets violently shoved onto specifically the crisis countries. So it's Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Cyprus, Ireland. Yeah. And so that's how and I think that's why Clint spent so much time on the Greek moment, is because again, if you think about this window, 2008 to 2012, it's okay, let's go back. Reunification is some kind of window for the left or some kind of politics to, redirect the course of Europe, right? That window gets missed. Then 2004 becomes another window in Germany. And again, there are mass protests in Germany against the austerity that was already imposed between 2001 to 2004. There are mass protests. It does become some kind of political window because obviously the SPD under Schroeder, right, gets removed from power, and they have to be in this whatever CDU, there's some other party, and then the SPD, that three-party coalition comes in. So there's a political leadership change that comes out of that 2004, 2005 moment. And Die Linke actually forms, right, in 2005, 2006. So let's say the 2004 to 2006 period is a second window of opportunity for redirecting this steering engine of Europe, right? That window gets missed, right? And then the third moment is 2008 to 2012, right, which is the unfolding of the global financial crisis and then the subsequent Eurozone crisis. And during that moment, it's obviously a time for the world to reassess and to say, hey, this German surplus model, which depends on a rest of EU deficit model, that model has exhausted itself and run its course, right? And so that is the moment that Clint's talking about, right? With Syriza, with Greece, is that was clearly another window for some kind of political activity to redirect the course of Europe. But instead, what happens in that 2008 to 2012 movement is that the way that we prolong this painful existence of the EU is that we say, okay, since the German surplus, rest of EU deficit model has exhausted itself, we're going to take the entire EU area and convert it into a surplus. Now, that's only possible because of two reasons. One, after 2008, China does a massive industrial stimulus cycle. And that kind of stimulus, so Chinese demand explodes, right? Because China's constructing like a ton of buildings, a ton of infrastructure, high-speed rail, factories, whatever. So that's providing a ton of demand for European industrial goods, right? So that's like, you know, if you think of like these large German companies like Siemens or you know, the French company Schneider or all of these other things, like they're exporting a huge amount of volumes to China to feed this industrial cycle, super cycle. Now, just a quick note on that so-called industrial super cycle in China after 2008. In retrospect, a lot of that was like bad money spent, meaning like it was very much like, you know, it was like what we'd call empty calorie GDP growth. A lot of it did not necessarily go into value creating projects, but low returning projects. So that's one way that this EU neoliberal model survived 2008, is that like, okay, we take the whole euro area, convert it into a surplus, pump that into China, right? Pump that into feeding the Chinese industrial economy demand. And at the same time, the US goes on a decade-long quantitative easing spree. And so the United States under Janet Yellen, right? And of course, that's like Obama has another 2 terms. That's the survival of this model after 2008. So the United States just then becomes, again, a massive dumping ground for all the surplus goods coming out, all the surplus goods and all the surplus capital coming out of China and coming out of Europe. So those are the two. So instead of like everything Clint was talking about, which is like, instead of taking up this political agency, this political possibility in that 2008 to 2012 window, the way in which we ensured the survival of this model is contingent on Chinese industrial stimulus, which has kind of now run its course, and then the United States as a massive, massive dumping ground, which since 2018 is becoming increasingly unavailable as a dumping ground, right? Meaning that the United States is increasingly putting up barriers to being treated as the world's dumping ground.
I think it's really interesting that you focus on these windows, because today I feel there's a sense of inevitability to all of this. I don't feel that the left sees windows in this looking back. And maybe it's also because there's not a strong force that might have pushed or explored if there really are these windows and what kind of windows. And also if you say there's like a contingency and maybe a different policy would have been possible, I'm still wondering, does it really have, or could it have had something to do with possibility for socialism?
Well, one thing I would just say quickly on that is, in my view, like again, when Clint was describing like why was Syriza unable to present a credible threat to Merkel, right, about Greece threatening to leave the EU and then potentially also triggering Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland to also consider leaving the EU, right, is like there's like obviously many tactical contingencies that they could have committed themselves to, like mass propaganda in Greece that, as Clint said, would convince the Greek people that leaving the EU is not going to be like Armageddon, right? And then the other thing is just like, I don't know, a bunch of media, could they have done like a bunch of media campaigns where the Syriza leaders are seen in a photograph meeting with the leaders of Italy and Portugal and whatever. Like there's all these tactical things. And I feel like while it's tempting to say like, oh, it's just contingency or incompetency that Syriza didn't do those things, I think we have to remember the death of the left. The death of the left means that any leftist party that would have come into power in 2015 would not have the political experience, would not have any political experience, and would not have the benefit of like an international social democratic movement or party behind it, right? So imagine like if we're going to play the contingency game. Like, imagine if, I don't know, the left weren't dead, and therefore the people in Syriza would have had like more political experience. They would have had this global sort of international, this international social democratic movement to not just like provide them tactical advice, but objectively be in support of them. Like, then we could start to consider how these were contingencies, right? But the death of the left makes a lot of this feel more inevitable than not, which is why like then we go into considering, well, how could mainstream politics have contingently been different? Because of course, like the CCP could have done things differently, right? Janet Yellen could have done things differently, right? But that's all like mainstream capitalist politics. That's not talking about contingency or competence or incompetence on the left. I don't know if Clint, you want to add to it.
And the reason that I'm focusing on that Syriza moment is because that sort of sets the cards all the way down. So Syriza is a left break, right? So yes, and that's the point that Tio's making. Okay, it's leftism. It is willing to ally with the right party, with the right nationalists in Greece. Okay, and that's what he's pointing to, that there's an absence of like class because the left is dead. Right, and we continue to repeat Stalinism, right? So that's the deeper argument that Tio's making around the Syriza moment. But if Syriza had left, then what would that have foreshadowed? That would have foreshadowed, right, the rest of the left populist moment. Okay, so the way that people talk about Marxist and even other like non-Marxist leftists, Bernie and Corbyn. Right, these were left populists, right, and so the teach-in yesterday that how does the millennial left come to be thought of, or what's the lowered horizon? Well, at least let's break with the Democratic Party, right? So Syriza doesn't break with the EU, the Bernie moment is not trying to break with the Democratic Party, okay. And so like that entire window of opportunity of actually like reconsidering the terms of neoliberalism, the terms of its crisis. And so there's like the death of the left is like goes quite deep because like it's not, when you just look like, so it's like Martin Sukenecht is obviously right. We need a mass socialist party of the working class to pose a revolutionary United States of Europe. All right? But as the Foucauldian says to him, there's been 2,000, Marxist sectarian parties since like 1980 in Germany, right? Like, so you have all of these little sects that are saying, that are, have the programmatic revolutionary line. The deeper problem also is why United States of Europe? Right? Like what is the, what is the Europe ideology that that Nikos is pointing to? Right? He's saying, this is the dominant thing. This is the dominant value. And you have to work within that value. So he's saying, well, Syriza betrayed that dominant value by not leaving it. Right?
Yeah.
And if the U.S. had a socialist party movement, they could have said, you guys can join the dollar.
Exactly.
Better than the euro, to be honest. No, I'm serious. Because if you think about it, everything in Greece, I remember I was at a firm and we were analyzing the risk and opportunities around it. Actually, people were salivating at the idea of Greece leaving the euro, which might sound odd because it's still the same assets and things that are there before. It's a very tourism-driven economy. They would be able to get a lot of dollars, euros, whatever they need to do. If you went and bought Greek hotels the day after it all happened, you probably make a lot of money, let alone the political implications of it. But obviously, Obama was never going to countenance that, and clearly Germany. I mean, I don't know what was the political reaction in Germany. The impression I had, and I wasn't that aware, was that the Germans were all like, I'm sorry to all the Germans in the room, were all like, oh, the dirty Southern Europeans, they spent too much money.
Was like, yeah, that's what I was saying.
Was there any attempt? Was there any attempt in Germany at all to critique that, or was it just yeah, they did that, but we should be nice to them.
So the left party exists by now.
Yes. So yeah, the link, like, what's the link of saying? So everybody could agree, oh, the Southern Europeans were dumb and they spent too much money, which is one that said is not really the case. But it's like, let's be harsh to them, Angela Merkel, or let's be nice to them, or it can be more of this critique that Lenta was talking about. But what actually did happen in Germany?
So does anybody know what Die Linke is saying during the time?
It's
I mean-
just they were kind of supporting democratic, like, but since they were not able to address a protest against the austerity policies for German workers, at least not sufficiently, they were not able to build up sufficient solidarity. Even there were solidarity campaigns of Die Linke, but given the media campaigns opposing Germany, supporting the Springer campaign against the Pleite Griechen, were pretty successful, and it was like those circumstances gave birth to the right-wing AfD, which was initially like the anti-Euro party, which was like against.
So they were in
lending more
support of
money to
Syriza.
the-
So they were in
to the-
support of Syriza the early AfD. They wanted Greece to leave the euro, or no?
No, I think they were kind of more pro-European. They were kind of. I'm not so sure.
Die
I
Linke.
the EU because they feared that Greece would stay in the EU
And they'd have to
would
bail
make
them
Germany
out.
pay.
Yeah.
So that was Die Linke's position.
No,
that was
AfD.
the,
Oh, was that
that was
AfD's
the
position?
birth of the AfD.
Oh, I see.
So they wanted to leave, which actually might have been more radical, is if Germany had
Yes,
left the
absolutely.
EU under the basis of Greece.
That's true.
Well, so I just want. Can I just say? Sorry, no. Go ahead.
No,
What were
no.
you gonna say?
Why couldn't the SPD? You said the SPD couldn't organize like anti-austerity protests among the German workers. Why was it they couldn't do that? Like they wouldn't take.
Like, I mean, the
The
big
German-
protests were the protests against the whole neoliberal reforms during Schröder.
It's just the SPD is already in power.
Yeah, I mean, that co-governing party, or like.
Yeah. And I just want just to go back to your thing about the the contingencies, like the Marx quote from the 18th Brumaire, like men make their own history, men make history, but not of their own accord.
Not under conditions they choose.
Yeah, men make history, but not under conditions that they choose. And it's like I feel like when I was like doing the research on this book and reading this whole account of Germany, it just felt like even we cannot say men make history. And that's really the death of the left, right? Is like, if you think about this narrative, it's like from Herzog to Schroeder in the SPD to Merkel in the CDU to Olaf Scholz. It's like, I don't know, it really just gives one the impression that, like, because of the death of the left, there really is no agency at all in politics. It's like every government is going to more or less do the same things. And as, like, capitalism and all these trade imbalances and capital imbalances change, like they'll just more or less have to adapt to however it's changing. So it's like if you read Olaf Scholz or Sarah Wagner-Knecht's position on China now, it's totally the same. You listen to Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer answer questions about how the UK is going to relate to Trump. Their answers are completely identical, right? So it's like a I'm not sure that actually addresses what you're saying, but it definitely just feels like all of this capitalist politics. It's just reacting to something underneath the surface, and they're really like, even we can say that there are quote windows, but like where was the, like, because of the death of the left, these windows are not, I don't know, they weren't real windows.
What does Ochi mean?
No.
No. So there was the Ochi campaign by Die Linke. So they
Right,
actually supported the no.
I remember
Yeah.
reading about that at some point.
So they had this solidarity campaign in supporting the Greek and Syriza in not leaving the EU. But then
In not leaving the EU?
in leaving the EU. But then when the whole political arrangement flopped, there was kind of a shock, and then we had at the same time the rise of the AfD, and so in this time there was this situation, as I can just retrospectively look at it now. there seems to be such a confusion of, okay, we actually failed, and at the same time, so we won and then we failed, and then the right is taking our slogans and is way more successful than we actually have been. So the right is more serious in their demand than the left has been before. I think this is kind of a trauma that is really growing into the coming years of it. But there was this campaign of support for Greece leaving the EU.
But was it again just but the problem is it just another negotiating tactic? Like, is anybody really serious about it? Right, that's the thing. That's what I think was the ultimate Syriza moment. It just shows that the left isn't serious.
So basically that's what it would have looked like. It would have been Die Linke in Germany and Syriza in Greece being resolutely willing to leave the EU.
Spain.
Right. So that would be the kind
of... We'll continue to have no tariffs between Germany and... just the fact that Greece is leaving doesn't mean we're going to impose a bunch of tariffs on Greece. Right? We're still going to continue our trade relations with Greece. Because then that would be the bluff.
Jasper, I think you had?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's interesting about Die Linke that Oskar Lafontaine, when he split from the SPD, founding Die Linke, he was opposed to the euro, the currency. So he said, we do not, because of the reason that you elaborated, because of different currency values and this exchange stuff and so on. And there's a speech by him in the 90s, late 90s, and he's saying what happened in 2014 because of this whole currency stuff. So the raison d'etre of Die Linke was, of course, in the beginning, to be against the EU and this, this domination politics through currency stuff,
No, yes.
So, sorry, you're saying Oscar, the guy who founded Die Linke actually had a critique in the 90s, right?
He said, Germany, due to Wiedervereinigung, he said, he was also opposed to East Germany getting the D-Mark. So he said they should have the DDR mark. I don't know what it's called. And then he was against Germany joining the euro as a currency. So he was against
the currency.
The first unification and the second.
Right. And did he articulate, because again, I imagine this, if we were to put ourselves in his shoes, from a tactical propagandist standpoint, right? The argument for Germany not to join the euro, right, but to keep the Deutschmark would have been, this argument would have been wildly unpopular among industrial capitalists, right, whose exports are being flattered by the existence of the euro. But the tactical propagandist argument, I guess that he would be making, is that keeping the Deutschmark would actually be really beneficial for German workers. Right. It put more money in their pockets, and the purchasing power of their wages would be significantly higher. It had to be a class thing, not a German argument.
I read a really big newspaper from the UK, I'm not sure, who had on its cover Lafontaine with the title "The Most Dangerous Man of Europe."
Red Oscar.
Yeah.
Red Oscar, right?
The problem was that, to be fair to the people who adopted the euro, is their vision was that it would ultimately lead to the United States of Europe. And so they recognize, I think the guy who came up with the euro won maybe not the Nobel Prize, but something for optimal currency unions. And on his own metrics, the euro made no sense. But his view was we should do it as a political project. And so the thing is that I think they all felt that something like 2012 would happen, and the hope would have been for them, I'm not saying that was good, the hope for them would have been that would force the issue. It would force aggregate debt, it would force harmonization of, basically all the parliaments together, but it obviously didn't. And so on that basis, maybe it would have made sense to break it apart. and redo something else. So we're kind of left in the worst of all worlds.
Right.
As in, like, we didn't even take the euro as far as it wanted to go.
Right, because we haven't been considering the leftist perspectives on that. Right?
Yeah.
Why are we not just trying to perfect the European Union?
Right.
Right, well, which is what somebody like Yanis Varoufakis would be trying to do. Like, make this actually a federated republic.
Yeah.
Right? It is fully democratized.
But to me, I guess, again, in the absence of a left, in the absence of like civic, social life in Europe, like that to me just sounds like an argument for a globalist administrative technocracy, which is what these two mainstream economists, Pettis and Klein, are making the bid for, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's have a much bigger, expanded European central bank. Let's have a like a giant European administrative apparatus that like goes and makes sure that the crisis countries like spend more on infrastructure and redistribute within their countries, right?
Mhm.
But why didn't they succeed with their ideas?
Why didn't these two guys?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you talk with neoliberals, sometimes they like, we need a world government, we need more like managing the world with institutions, and there are some also. I wonder, you didn't talk about the IWF. I thought they had a role in this whole Greece thing, like with the. Anyway,
The IMF and the World Bank.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I am.
The Troika.
Troika, yes, this was, but there are these institutions who somehow rule the world, seem to rule the world, but somehow not. So it's hard to understand this. But I wonder, is there from a Marxist way to see at these things, maybe some necessity for not having such world governments, rather having all these little states competing with each other.
Meaning from a Marxist standpoint, you're saying why is there not an alternative to world government from a Marxist standpoint?
No, I mean, why is there no world government? Why is there no EU government? This is more
I think that there is a world government. Okay, it's not the like lizards in the back room. Okay, and it's just the Bonapartist state, right? Which is constituted through conflict and crisis. Okay, and it's coming into being after 1848, and it's coming into being through war, right? So how do states cooperate? By going to war. Right, they can, that's one of the ways. Right? That's what Marx is seeing in the Crimean War in 1850s. It's like, this is actually how the capitalist states can cooperate, right? In suppressing the revolution and suppressing 1848. Right, they can go to war in Russia, right, in Crimea. So the IMF and like the World Bank, these are part of the global New Deal, right? And the idea is precisely that we're going to now take this progressive liberalism and we're going to like finance economies. Growing economies and make sure everybody has their monetary policy right. Okay.
So they are like a daddy state thing, right?
But it actually comes out of Keynes's attempt to do what Pettis and Klein are trying to do.
Right. So the world government is just a capitalist state, which is international. And this is actually what Jens on that Frankfurt panel is saying, is that the EU is not something above these various nations. The EU is precisely because of these nations, right? That it's internal to like these European nations, right? And so what you're saying is like, if we had Lexit, right? We had Grexit and Italian exit and Portuguese exit and maybe German exit, right? Then we're just splintering all of, and that's like the point would be, as Gary on the Brexit panel was saying, what is the effect of this on the class consciousness of the workers? Right? So does this open more or less opportunities? Okay, for actually organizing both politics and society towards a transitional power. Okay? And so is the EU an advance or a non-advance for like workers organizing society and the need for politics? is more of the question. So it's like, it already is an international state. There's just various ways that this international state gets constituted through its political, economic conflicts.
But I think, isn't there also the problem with the millennial left itself, that the only task that they try to set themselves is to better the conditions for the struggle for socialism? So it's like, it seems that all the left groups that emerged out of the millennial left became a shock from these external crises that capitalist politics imposed on them, due to the fact that they only tried to manage better conditions for a future fight for socialism. So it seems that the way that, for example, Syriza could have actually tried to gain power, to pose the power question. Not even, I don't want to say that this is actually socialism what they tried to implement, but they actually posed the power question there, or the question of the political. They went back to, I don't know, maybe we can get better conditions, as we discussed it before. And this goes also into the question of open windows, because it seems that from reunification till 2006-8, it seems like a long period of whatever, and then the crisis comes, and suddenly people think now is the time to actually politicize people. But actually, crisis is not the moment where people should.
Right?
Yes, so it's so it's the fault of the left that this crisis went for nothing.
I mean, and when you say it's the fault of the left, it's like the 20th century left, right? If there was anything that could actually take advantage of the crisis of neoliberalism, it would have come out of, started in the new left, and would have been ready for 2000, like the 2000s, right? I think this is like what the windows are. Like when we're talking about all of this, it's like all, the death of the left in general. It's total like counterfactual history. I'll use this opportunity to level something about Mike McNair, because initially because I remember you had this CPGB's position, and I also want to say that IMT/RCP had the same position, but I could be wrong, so I don't want to say this for sure. But of like the Brexit debate is a distraction, and that we can't, and it's like specifically about the deterioration of the Conservative Party. I want to add that it also fucking split the Labour Party.
Right.
And that at this time, the CPGB is trying to orientate itself towards the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and thus gags themselves on this question. That's why Mike McNair is not able to say this, right? And actually the left in general, with its like Europhilia and Europhobia, it's actually, at least in the UK, and I know like the left, but I think in general we can perceive like when the left, in the absence of like the independence of the left that has to take stakes on capitalist politics, the left will be split alongside those. Which pressure point of the left-right split in the Labour Party can it take, right? So that's why it was like crazy in the UK when Brexit happened, because there were people that were completely like, Brexit should not be happening, we need to reverse this.
They wanted the House of Lords to reverse it.
Yeah, we want
House of Lords and the Queen herself.
Yes.
Aristocrats to save like the plebs from like voting against their own interests.
Right.
And this is ultimately what brought Jeremy Corbyn's what like really destroyed the Labour Party, and maybe made way for it kind of gave them a clean slate with Starmer.
Right.
But they ran the 2019 election with a second referendum, right? So they're actually like, okay, we're going to pose the question again, and we're going to let the British people do another referendum on the EU. Maybe just to go back to the original thing of like Mike McNair, there's kind of like this background politics playing in this panel, that they're all trying to orientate themselves to the Labour Party in the same way on various levels of unconsciousness.
And can you say more? Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Say
I was just gonna say, can you say more about what that split is in the Labour Party? Because it's these Corbynistas, right, who are now entering the Labour Party, taking over the local, or trying to like enter these like local municipal councils or whatever, versus what, Mateus was pointing to, like, the trade union workers. Is that what you're referring to? In terms of what's splitting the Labour Party?
No, that's like 2015, right? So the Labour Party, the current moment is like that's just kind of what we're trying to.
No, in 2015 is what I mean.
Oh, okay. Yep.
It's the Corbynistas, right?
So Corbyn is able to make a Labour Party constituency is partially college-educated, liberal, petty bourgeois, tofu-eating, North London workerati who fucking love the EU, and traditional working class of Northern England. All the whole red wall, right? That Boris Johnson managed to go over, and the split was roughly on the fact that there was Labour Party found it really difficult to reconcile those two constituencies,
right? But
because
there's also like what's going on here historically is also a generational split between Corbyn's generation and the millennials. So actually, Corbyn is he's Eurosceptic. That's like the word that was used. His generation was very, recognized the EU more as a neoliberal project.
So Corbyn's own supporters are the ones saying we want to stay in the EU.
Yes, he needs to. He doesn't that's his constituency. Those are the people that vote him into power. And this is kind of where you need to get into like the weird 4D chess of the Labour Party of like, okay, who's getting like Corbyn into power, and like the older like Gen Xers into power, and how are the Gen Xers then trying to like ameliorate themselves to the millennial left, and so that's where it gets kind of tricky. But there's this weird thing where the left itself isn't talking to. There's no generational discussion between the Eurosceptic Gen X left and the Europhilic millennial left. It's just not. There's no discussion. Where it does happen is like in the sectarian groups, kind of, right? Like with the Trotskyist group would be like, or even like a communist. So in the Communist Party, like with the CPV, they can be a bit more openly like Eurosceptic, and they can rehearse you the discussion, right? This is the party line. This is what we stand on. But you don't get that in the Labour Party. And because the millennial left didn't have these like institutions through which it could like have a debate or a conversation intergenerationally, it could never really. That's what. It's fascinating how messed up and convoluted that moment is for the Labour Party.
And can I just say, did you guys have something else on the UK? I was thinking about your question about the kind of world government versus national government, and I feel like again, in the absence of a left, whether it's a pro-national politics, like pro-nationalist politics, or whether it's a pro-EU technocracy super government politics, like they're both actually just perpetuating reactionary Wilsonian liberalism, which is a form of Bonapartism. Because whether it's the pro-nationalist model or the pro-EU technocracy super government model, it's just a way of like figuring out how do we manage, how do we manage mass discontents in capitalism by using state power to violate the rights of society. Like both of these forms, like that's what they just become because there is no left, right? And today, like I feel like today there's a lot of rhetoric around like people feel like national borders are being undermined, national sovereignty is like becoming ineffective, like even if people were to take power in a specific nation, like they're kind of helpless, and this is of course more magnified in the smaller, economically weaker countries. Like they're experiencing this sort of crisis of the nation state or whatever, but really like I feel like all they're experiencing is just that as capitalism gets reconstituted, Bonapartism gets reconstituted, right? And the lines get redrawn. So whether or not we oscillate between, pro-EU's world government or whether or not we oscillate between pro-nationalist government, it's just a way of like redrawing Bonapartism so that we have this oppressive, reactionary form of managing capitalist discontents with state power, right? And that's why, like, we emphasize so much, like, the left is dead. And that's all it is, because the left is dead.
This leads me to a question I had before. This is when it comes to Syriza getting into power. I think you somehow talked about what could they have done to establish kind of a left opposition against the EU politics, and then they betrayed them when they got into power. I wondered, was it maybe the wrong move to get into power anyway? Wouldn't that, since they are in power, their whole job is to be this Bonapartism, to manage the discontents in a way. So if they would have been like real left, one could expect to say like, no, we say, okay, we don't go into parliament because we know what happens. We are gonna be forced to betray our whatever politics and the masses in a way. So
well, that's why they were left populist, not necessarily like Marxist, right? And so that left populist moment, I think that's where I think that the key issue is that there is just not actually an imagination of the of a Greek society outside the EU, right? Of Greece's new intersocial relations, right, outside of the EU, right? That can't even be imagined, right? Like why, that they can't even imagine inviting to come buy up these cheap hotels now and come build a factory here, right? And so it's like that left populist moment, like, yes, why didn't they just like not go into power? Well, somebody was going to negotiate with Merkel, right? And then what was interesting is that this was done from the left, and it came to define like the left as left populist. So that sort of model is taken up. It's the left populist moment from Syriza to Bernie, of like, we are going to try to take over, we get into Greek government, right? We're going to try to take over the Democratic Party. Corbyn actually takes over the Labour Party, right?
And I'm not sure that we can say Syriza betrayed, like, the Greek people, or, like, what they failed to do, again, is they failed to make a credible threat of leaving the EU to get a better deal for their people. And, like, that, again, like, what we were talking about in terms of, like, what's contingent about that is in the immediate level. We can say, oh, there's some contingencies. Maybe there's things that they could have done to make a more credible threat. But maybe what's not contingent about that is that because there is no left, right, these people they lack political experience, and they also lack, like, the objective support of an international working class movement, right? So, like, I'm not sure that we can say that they that they necessarily betrayed their mandate. And again, it's a question not just of, like, we're evaluating them, like, in this immediate context, we're evaluating them just based on, like, how responsible of a national government did they put together. We're so far from evaluating them on the basis of, did they contribute to the struggle for socialism? That's, like, not what was on the table, right? And I would say, like, in a way, like, of course, economic upturns and downturns, the economic environment that you secure for your people, there are stakes to that. There are stakes that are extremely many 10 or 20 or 1,000 steps removed from the struggle for socialism, but there are stakes to securing a better or worse economic environment. Because even in the three windows we were discussing, like reunification 2004 and then 2008 to 2012 in Germany, these are like three horrible economic windows in Germany, right? We said the 1990s, stagnation. 2004, like, this is like coming out of a very painful, deep 3-year recession. 2008 to 2012, I mean, it's just like Armageddon all over the world, right? So it's like, it's this idea that, like, this heuristic that some people on the left have that, like, oh, when things get worse, like, people get more radical. You know, that's obviously not the case. It tends to be the case that actually when there's a prolonged period of capitalist accumulation and growth, that capitalist accumulation somehow also is a accumulation of labor. It's a formation of assets that go to then absorb labor. That environment of prosperity and optimism somehow might be better conditions 1,000 steps removed in terms of constituting the types of civic social organizing that could maybe one day, reconstitute a socialist politics, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is first is I don't think the pro-nation versus pro-EU thing, again, in the absence of a left, it doesn't mean one thing or the other for freedom, which is the concern of Marxism at the end of the day, right? And then second, I think as it relates to Syriza, we can say that there are stakes to getting a better or worse economic deal for people, but it's only in this very, very indirect way that I described of maybe a better economic environments, maybe more growth, maybe more optimism, maybe less fear and scarcity, in people's hearts, somehow provides some kind of environment, not for socialist politics, but just some kind of better environment for building up human material.
And would you say that because the basis is the same, you said there is no left, the left is dead, and today it's the same as it was, 20 or 30 years ago. So would you say the possibilities are also the same, or has this experience, has this time period in one or the other way, have consequences, maybe on the consciousness? I don't know.
Yeah.
This goes back to the question of the history of the millennial left that was brought up yesterday. It's actually, that's the task is to articulate precisely where the left failed, or where the window of opportunity closed, or where these tiny, tiny moments of potential are lost. Right? That's can we make the history useful, or can we make these events useful? That's a task.
Are we just in the exact same place or not?
Well, maybe your question depends on what people in Platypus ultimately do.
Yeah.
Right? It's are we in a better or worse place in terms of reflecting on the history of the left? I think, doesn't that depend on Platypus? Who else is reflecting on the history of the left? Who else is trying to grow with the times, right? Meaning the rest of the left, as we all know, they just forget everything that happened as soon as it happens, right? So if it's a matter of if time, if experience is a form of, we talk about the accumulation of capital, which we talk about the accumulation of labor. We also talk about the accumulation of historical consciousness, right? As the ability to actually objectify the world and experience history, right? That seems to be something that only Platypus is really doing. So the question of could we be better or worse given this experience, this accumulation of experience, is a question of some kind of historical consciousness. So even maybe the death of the millennial left depends on, what comes out of the death of the millennial left. Maybe that even just depends on Platypus.
But not directly.
Yeah.
It's not like Platypus is going to go build the party.
Right.
Right. We have to critically liquidate the 20th century.
Yeah.
Right. When Trotsky says the 19th century did not pass in vain because we have the Second International. Right. So the repetition of 1848 and 1905 is now going to be led by the working class. Right. So the 19th century did not pass in vain. The 20th century did pass in vain. Right, and and now it just kind of repeated it, the new left kind of repeated itself in a shallow form in the millennials, and so it's that accumulation of dead history, the growing corpse, that's what has to be critically liquidated. Does that mean the Socialist Party, in and of itself?
I just had a short comment on your question and maybe the relationship of the left populist moment and basically the consciousness of sectarian Marxists. Because you mentioned Martin Suchanek calling for the socialist United States of Europe, and I always felt at that panel in 2015 or 16, I felt he was really good. He was a good speaker, and we have hosted him for like dozens of times since then, and I felt like every year he became more and more vulgar, and he would move more and more away from what he said on that panel. And right now he's with his crew on the campus protests, calling for BDS. You know, so this,
Right.
He went all the way, and like he's an old Trotskyist. You know, he's someone who knows his stuff, but you can really see how there was a moment which also heightened the consciousness of the sectarians in a way, and brought up like their own history in a more conscious kind of way than is the case now. So this leads me also to my question, which is if the left is completely disappeared in this current moment, like what do you make of the kind of right populist parties that gain more and more traction in the European Union over the last years, especially with regards to their relationship to the EU, because we talk, as Lisa said before, like what the left is demanding, the right pushes through, and then you have something like the AfD coming out of this moment, actually wanting to leave the EU, but then becoming this different party during the migration crisis. And like if you listen to them now, they don't want to leave the EU. They just want to like restructure it. So it's more. You said you had these three alternatives before that came from the left, like leaving, Brexit.
More Europe.
Yeah.
More Europe, or
civil disobedience within.
Kind of civil disobedience, and I feel like these right populist parties, they're kind of in between reform and maybe a bit of civil disobedience, a bit of like hassle against the EU. But I don't have the feeling that there's any one of these parties that really is pushing for leaving the EU. The more, especially the more closer they come to power, or if they even are in power. And my question is just like, I find it really hard to navigate all these different parties because they come of the same like post-neoliberal right populist moment, but they all have different kind of positions depending on the country. And my question is, what do you think is the general trend of these parties in relation to the EU? What are their goals? Where is the world moving if the right is actually leading it?
So I think part of I don't think that she was saying anything about where those parties are going, but what the context is that those parties are going to be taking up.
And that is a change in the objective conditions, so-called. Yeah.
Right. So what what was the Euro crisis about? All right, it was about this trade surplus, right? Which is what Adam Tooze, Yanis Varoufakis, and these Hobson guys are all saying in like a different way, right? There's like, and we can just critique various forms of what they're saying, but I think what we're setting up with this is like, whoever comes to power in the EU and however the EU is restructured, it's going to be dealing with the fact that the U.S. is closing, like no more dumping surplus. China's going to need to have it to dump a surplus, and that so like the new pressures on the EU are going to be around those global trade imbalances.
So kind of like, does it matter for us who takes that up? Like someone's going to take that up. And that's why I was saying maybe what more or less does matter is like there can be a slightly more growth or slightly less growth. And maybe that does matter. Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly throw something into the discussion that in Germany the millennial left, like more anarchisty organizations, the EL and Uns Ganze had this analysis in 2005. And what you are saying reminds me a lot of what they were writing during this time, which brings us back to yesterday and the teaching yesterday, and like that we should maybe focus also anarchism during this Occupy era that followed as like maybe a more serious attempt, like looking back to ask the question of politics, because obviously they were very voluntaristic, and the EL also folded itself into Die Linke and doing like campaign for Die Linke, but they did have these analyses that were like inherited by all the other radical leftist groups after them.
Can you remember exactly what they were saying? It's just specifically with respect to like the trade surplus, or
Yeah, they were saying that it doesn't matter to like get power and do realpolitik to get a better deal out of the EU or to reform it because it's still capitalism. And that Europe, like the EL had a slogan that Europe deserves something better than the EU, and that the EU just means poverty for everyone.
Right.
So it is like this very anarchist perspective, but like with our discussion,
legitimate critique, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
There seems to at least be like conserving of a utopian horizon.
Right, and a negative conception
because
of
of course
society.
they like have this analysis. They're like, we're selling out our happiness.
Right.
And then they say like our answer is communism, and we need to work towards communism. And of course the question is how and what do you mean by that? But yeah, I just wanted to throw this into discussion because we're talking about
these people?
the interventionistische Linke.
Clara was a Chicago.
Yeah, and then there was another interventionistische Linke, like the interventionist left.
Ah, okay.
And then there was Ums Ganze, another big organization that formed at the same time. Just before the Occupy movement.
Right.
The non-parliamentary arm of the left party. That's sometimes the.
So I asked this question in my teaching yesterday, thinking about the presentation today, about how the dumping of, from the German point of view, the exporting of surplus goods has a parallel with. Okay, let me go back to the American context. The dumping of foreign goods in the American market has a parallel with the bubble and burst of the bubble in the housing market from all of the excess capital that gets kind of stored in this housing market bucket that's not big enough to contain it all. And that made me ask why wasn't, after 2008, why wasn't there a resurgence of 90s anarchism, actually? Because this is exactly what they've been protesting against in the 90s, right?
Because there were these 90s, anarchist, anti-globalization protests from the left in the United States.
Right. And similarly, this makes me want to ask, why wasn't there, a German Syriza that was pitching the case not in terms of solidarity with these poor Greek workers that are suffering, but actually no, it would be to the benefit of the German workers, right? If we broke this rotten deal between Germany and Greece.
The EL also organized international demos, for example. They connected with leftists abroad, and Toby from Cologne stresses that of course it was a farce, and of course connecting with people in other countries meant, I don't know, maybe reading their papers or something.
Maybe you should find someone from, someone who was actually involved in this interventionist left group from that time and do a interview for the Platypus Review with them. That would be interesting, have them reflect on kind of this whole history, I think I would be very interested in reading something like that.
Me too.
And I think your question about why didn't we see a 90s resurgence, right? Why didn't we return to the 90s? So 90s is these people are protesting globalization, globalized neoliberalism. Globalized neoliberalism blows up in 2008. Why don't we see, right? I mean, we don't see it in a way, but we do see it in a way, which is there are two people in the 80s and 90s who are speaking out against globalization, and they are Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Right? And they returned to the stage in 2015.
And so, and then this makes me think of what you were saying, Rebecca, about that Corbyn was actually kind of he was being dragged away from his Euroscepticism by his millennial supporters. That when we talk about the millennial...
The Labour Party as well.
Right, when we talk about the millennial left, we're often not actually talking about the millennials on the millennial left. Right, but just as often we're talking about the disputes and schisms that the recruitment of the millennials to the left provoked in the older generation, right? So this kind of happens in the ISO in 20 2014, they have this crisis called the Renewal Faction that's about this question of what they call the popular front with the Democrats. And they're dissatisfied with this, going to rallies with Democratic politicians and so on, and they leave the ISO, but it's the older Gen X members that leave the ISO, right, who say that the ISO is stuck in the 90s moment, right? So, to the point that, I guess, so my question then is, when we talk about the death of the millennial left, the millennials are, very often not even the best people to ask about what was learned or what was accomplished potentially by the millennial left, right? But somehow, that whatever the common wisdom that the millennial left might have produced, right, it's somehow held in tension between the millennials and the Gen X and the boomers, who were all thrown into these disagreements and disputes with each other by the recruitment of the millennial left.
Yeah, there is this, what's his name? Ron Paul.
Ron Paul.
Okay. Yeah, there's a great YouTube video from the 90s where Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders are taking on Alan Greenspan, right? And Alan Greenspan is basically saying, he's defending the neoliberal trade model because he's like, it doesn't matter where the washing machine is produced, right? It just matters that it's cheaper so that Americans can afford it. And he also claims it doesn't matter if, Walmart replaces General Motors as the largest employer in the United States.
Right. And then Bernie is grilling him and saying things that are going to sound exactly like Donald Trump later.
Exactly.
Right. He's like, no, it does matter that it's being built in America.
Yeah.
And where you're paying the workers $10 as opposed to $1.
Right.
Right. And it does matter that we're producing engines instead of just having service workers.
Right. It changes your community, for example. If everybody in your community is employed part-time haphazardly by Walmart versus employed full-time, right, at GM or something like that. And so then if you go to 2015, 2016, it's who's still saying that? It's Trump. Bernie has forgotten a lot of what he was saying in the 90s, especially not just in 2016, but then especially in 2020, right? And go ahead.
But isn't this precisely the case of a similar situation to Corbyn's, in which Bernie Sanders is on one hand pulled into his own anti-globalistic kind of left populist direction, but also being held back by his own petty bourgeois, progressive, conservative,
by the millennial left,
millennial leftist supporters who couldn't really go beyond it. Because I think maybe I kind of from this teaching I left with the sensation that you might not appreciate the scale and depth of ideological commitment of people in the EU to the EU.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if most of Platypus members gathered here were kind of, aggressively pro-EU before they joined Platypus. That wouldn't be a big surprise. Because you go, and
before they joined
to take up a few questions which were raised, why didn't we see resurgence of anarchism in the 90s? And in the early 2000s in the way, or late 90s and early 2000s, in the way that we had around the,
WTO,
and all of that. Well, we didn't see it because in 1989 and 1991, it seemed like globalism had won, like neoliberalism had won. History's over, right? And now it will all be just democracy, open borders, we'll be able to travel, and so on. And why did German workers take it, right?
Yeah.
German workers took it because you get state handouts, you can be at university for 15 years, you'll go on Erasmus to Spain for a year. You have a kind of very subjective and ephemeral, but still important sense that you are part of Europe, right? That really it reaches beyond. Like if you stand up, there is a sticker on your chair which says, for €1, University of Leipzig. It's there, and you can propaganda. There is a lot of propaganda around that, and
cross it out.
Really, it's like.
Yeah.
It's really important. It really matters. And maybe Syriza wasn't able to leave the EU because they weren't able to make a case to the Greek people that it would be viable, or maybe the threats from Germany and the rest of the EU were so serious that they wouldn't dare to do it, because just to remind you, the UK got punished really badly as well. And was a much bigger country without profound crisis when it was happening.
Yeah, I think you're totally right that this idea of Europe, or this idea of the EU specifically, like maybe it's a major obstacle, ideological obstacle to overcome for any left. Right?
I think really what the left would have to realize was, as you brought up before, is that we are locked in that kind of worst possible world where we have the monetary union that didn't even go all the way, but there is no fiscal union. There is no real democracy in Europe because European Parliament is fiction, right?
Yeah.
It's just a poll. Yeah. Really.
Yeah.
And and the left is still enchanted by this idea.
Yeah.
And because they recognize that just like China cannot be divided in half, Europe also ultimately needs to be united in this or that way.
But do you think it's more because the middle class people
of unifying China that are backing up one?
It's like, the basic, you met some people who told you about why they were mad about Brexit in Britain. They're mad about Brexit because they have to wait in the non-EU line when they go on holiday to Spain versus not.
Or Germany.
So to them, or Germany, or whatever.
No, I think it's
Even
deeper.
I have to be fair to the
goes
Brits.
deeper
The
than
Brits
that.
do allow everybody in through the same e-gates, so gotta give something to the Brits. But no, whatever. but the middle class people will say there's more free trade allowed between places. There's more. I can go live in any of these countries. I can go visit any of these countries frictionally. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's more freedom. So what would you say to them?
I would just say that EU is, I think, Mateus, you're absolutely right that there's like this deep ideological obstacle around Europe that, again, I think goes back to Wilsonian liberalism. Like, in my view, the EU doesn't seem to be a project that's motivated by Kantian bourgeois cosmopolitanism, but really comes out of this reactionary, this 20th century counter-revolution, World War I, World War II, Bretton Woods, neoliberalism, this progressive liberal sort of counter-revolution. So I feel like Europe, the concept of Europe as imagined on the basis of the 20th century, and then this love and attachment and commitment to the EU on that basis of the concept of Europe, like that needs to be overcome, right? And like to Niels's point, like about these other parties that are springing up, is there a party in Germany that's just saying the EU is good for elites and bad for workers? Is there any, it's like, but why? Right? Like, why? That's just like one of the, like, you have every combinatorial possibility of stupid positions you can take all over the place, but you don't have that one.
Because there would be a left position.
What?
There would be a left.
Maybe that would.
That's what that's what the Brexit Party did in the UK.
Yes,
they literally, like Brexit, UK, they're like, the EU is good for elites and bad for workers.
Right. And I think, and again, I would say, kind of to line up your question and your question about like, well, what are the things that are maybe different going forward that any party in Europe will have to contend with? From my account, the two things that are different going forward versus in the past is, one, you have this insane rapid slowdown of Chinese consumption that is creating Chinese excess capacity that the world, namely Europe, is going to have to deal with one way or the other. And two, the US is like closed for dumping. Like perhaps the only political agency or contingency we've discussed this entire evening is the American people in 2016. Like, right? Because what did they do? Like, they changed the course of history by putting up the barriers to America serving as, this infinite reserve that can just absorb and sustain these trade imbalances in the rest of the world, right? That's to Clint's point, been perpetuated since the 1970s. It's like, but that had nothing to do with the left, right? So like maybe, okay, but I would say those are the two things that are different. America, like trade war under Biden, Trump, whoever, and then Chinese excess capacity. and slow down in Chinese consumption. So think about it this way. Let's say you're a large German industrial conglomerate. Today, you ship a bunch of stuff to China, like for Chinese consumption and Chinese and domestic investment, right? And at the same time, you're not really competing with that much Chinese goods in Europe. So what's different? What's changed now for that company is like you can't ship as much stuff as you did to China before because their internal consumption and investment is rapidly falling and slowing down, right? And on the other hand, their stuff is coming here. And so you can that's the double whammy, right? That can confront a major German company, a major employer of German people. And so far, at least what I've seen in the data is like there is a way in which Germany is increasing its domestic spending, right? Which is like on defense.
Yeah. Right.
That's one way, like that is, and again, I'm not trying to be like alarmist or anything, especially because, as I've said, I don't think like things getting worse or whatever is actually any preconditions for leftist organizing or something. But like that's obviously one possible outcome of trying to rebalance, right? Is like Germany can choose to spend more money on public education, on hospitals, on repairing its bridges and roads, right? It can also choose to spend more money on defense. From a current account and financial account perspective, it's kind of all the same, right? And if you're going to think about like, imagine if like, okay, we've said the United States, actually Trump put this in an interview that he just did with the All In podcast. He said the United States is no longer going to be the piggy bank for the rest of the world, right? So now if you think, okay, just imagine if the United States were this wonderful piggy bank, right? That has sustained the elites of Germany, China, all over the place, right? For the last, 5 decades. Imagine if countries could force the United States to continue to be the piggy bank. How could they? I mean, they can do that in a number of ways, right? One is they could try to influence, electoral outcomes in the United States so that the government in power in the United States continues to promote the strategy of being a piggy bank. And if that fails, and if the American people put someone in power that's not right, that's not okay with the piggy bank, they can try to invade the U.S. and do it through force, right? But obviously, it's America. That's not going to happen, right? But where can you do that? In other countries that are not America, right? So if I'm Germany or if I'm China and I'm trying to find other piggy banks, right? I can try to influence, politics and ideology or whatever in other countries so that those countries are favorable to my trade policy that my elites want, and maybe their elites want it too, right? So I can try to do that. But if they have some kind of, democratic, whatever, they have a change in leadership and that leadership doesn't want to do it anymore, then I can also invade and try to replace their government with one that is going to be more favorable to making their country like a piggy bank, right? So that's the other, of course, that's the other way this whole breakup of the EU can go. And Pettis and Klein are pretty explicit about that. Like they think of themselves as the contemporary version of Hobson in 1902, trying to avoid, Hobson's a progressive liberal. He's like, this internal class imbalances is really bad because eventually trade wars lead to hot wars. Mm-hmm. So Hobson's trying to avert war and the collapse of bourgeois society. And that's what Pettis and Klein see themselves as doing in Europe, in China, and wherever. They're the progressive liberals that want to avoid war with a globalist administrative super government, right? But and then last anecdote is so the defense companies in Germany are obviously doing very, very well, and the German auto companies are not doing well, and there is because of exactly the dynamic I described with China, and there's actually now thousands of people that are being laid off in the German auto sector, and they're working now they've been repurposed and they're working now for the big German defense company Rheinmetall, right? So there's again, in the absence of left, things will just It's like we're filling a bubble, like we're filling a container. Like things will just fill it out. So whether or not, like whatever party it's going to be, they're just going to fill out the container in whatever way.
One question. Maybe you said it implicitly, but who's going to be the next piggy bank? What do you think? Who's going to be forced to be it? Who's going to be invaded? Was it some idea about this?
I thought of the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, right?
But the point, like the provocation, right, is that
Yeah.
Africa and like the Middle East,
They're not rich enough to be the piggy bank.
For China.
The Belt
Germany
and Road
is.
Initiative has to come through Europe, right?
And Germany means the rest of Europe. Which is now this is going to be the cause of the conflict. The surplus economy, that surplus model is now coming to roost.
Against each other.
Right.
And that's the other thing is like now there's this high-speed industrial rail that's coming up between Chongqing and Sichuan province in China and Budapest, right? That Germany is quite receptive to. So a lot of these goods can be like 95% of it can be finished basically in China, right? Very efficient, super great ecosystem in terms of the supply chain. Come through this rail, like it's literally a train from China to Europe, right? And they can do the last 5% of the final assembly in Hungary and maybe in Germany, right? BYD is building the Chinese EV company is building a factory in Germany. Other Chinese companies will build factories in Germany. And to whatever extent, again, whether it's Olaf Scholz or Sarah Wagner-Knecht, they seem to be quite favorable to Chinese investment, right? So it's like it depends on how each country decides to navigate the two new conditions that I proposed, right? So if there's this train line, right, from China to Europe, and all of these, these goods can be kind of, the final assembly can be done in Hungary or Germany or wherever. From Germany, it can just go throughout the rest of Europe. And last thing I want to say is like in this New Left Review article that Lisa sent me, interviewing Sarah Wagner-Knecht, it was New Left Review, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when she gets asked, right, about China, she says, I prefer the Chinese to invest in Germany because when the Chinese invest, they have a 100-year time horizon. Whereas when it's American hedge funds doing it, they have a very short time horizon and they're just greedy and they're in it for the money. That's
the leftism
ideology. That's her like anti-capitalism is the way it's being appropriated is to fill out the container, right? It's like her anti-capitalism is just the capitalist politics that whoever elites in Germany need for the current moment.
Can you say something about why you chose to focus on the book by Klein and Pettis? So what is special about their account? How is it different from other accounts? Is it interesting because it's this neo-Hobsonian?
Yeah. That's a great. So it's actually just because Danny Jacobs in Platypus told me to read it in 2022. So I read it. But Clint mentioned, Adam Tooze, Verify. I mean, there's like a bajillion of these. I mean, to take out Varoufakis, Adam Tooze, Pettis, Klein. I mean, there's a ton of these mainstream economists that are saying things now that, to your point, actually like people have been saying for a very long time. It's just now the mainstream economists are saying it. Right? Whereas all these mainstream economists were, backing neoliberalism 20 or 30 years ago. And that also indicates to me, like, that's why it's like this question of how to reconstitute neoliberalism. It's like opposing neoliberalism is no longer anti-establishment. It's like the establishment knows that in order to save capitalism, we have to oppose neoliberalism. Pettis and Klein are like hardcore establishment people, even when they write about how much the German workers are suffering from this whole model. It's all in the spirit of like we need to avert the next like conflict that's going to be terrible, right? Like it's in the spirit of like all these people need to be better administered too.
And I think in terms of because basically you're like what does it have to do with the left?
Yeah.
Right? Is basically like the question.
Yeah.
And it comes to also like what Nils is saying about what is this? What are all these right-wing parties and everything. And I think that container that's being filled, right, in the absence of a self-conscious leftist leadership of society, in the absence of the working class leading the crisis, which is clearly not, right? The working class is not self-consciously leading the crisis, and there's no leftist critique of that happening.
Which is
right?
In Lenin's time.
Which is there in Lenin's time, right? Which is why you can do a dialectical critique of Hobson and Hilferding, right, at the height of imperialism, right? So I think the opportunity for the left to intervene in the crisis of neoliberalism is past, right? That's why we focus on the Syriza to Bernie moment. Mm-hmm. Okay, that was the...
Or maybe it was even earlier.
That opportunity is in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah.
Right, which is also the spirit of Blaine's teaching. By the time Bernie enters the scene, it's done.
Right.
And so we now have to be looking at, okay, well, what is the shape of post-neoliberalism, right? So what is the shape of post-neoliberalism coming into view? Okay, first it was just post-Fordism. Mm-hmm. It's only later that we call it neoliberalism. Yeah. So we're not sure, there's all kinds of theories about, how to what is this post-neoliberal world, right? But for the left, I think what's a key question is, okay, obviously the left is not going to be shaping post-neoliberalism.
No.
Right? So, and these right-wing parties, they're not fascist, right? They're constituting the new center, right? The post-neoliberal center.
If
right?
they actually succeed.
If they succeed, right? And so the question is, okay, being ahead of the curve is going to mean, all right, we need to be educating, or let's put it this way, intervening in the miseducation of the new generations of the left, insofar as that will exist at all. Yeah. And people who are drawn to these ideas of history or whatever, freedom, right? So that when the crisis of post-neoliberalism comes, there may actually be a working class politics.
And so that the language of the left and the name of Marxism is not just used yet again to justify the new status quo, because that's the thing that comes out in all these mainstream, economists or politicians who are desperately trying to save this ginormous, crisis, right? Is they all want an expansion of state power. That's what they fall back on in order to deal with the whole mess that we're describing, right? They all want that. And so if the dead left continues trotting along in its current formation, perhaps it will miseducate the next generation, to Clint's point, by using and abusing and perverting the language of the left and the history of the left to merely justify this expansion of state power over society that the establishment seems to be gravitating towards. And the other thing, just quickly on why this book and why Hobson, is Clint and I were joking about how we could be accused of LARPing imperialism, highest stage of capitalism, because obviously in imperialism, Lenin is not critiquing objective capitalist politics. He is critiquing, two high symptoms, right? Which is the progressive liberalism of Hilferding on the one hand, the progressive liberalism of Hobson on the one hand, and the social democratic Marxism on the other hand through Hilferding and also Kautsky, right? So and of course in his time he's able to objectify imperialism, he's able to have this kind of subjective reason about imperialism, because imperialism is also being produced by the social democratic movement. Right, it's the social democratic movement in Germany, right? It's so there's something directly subjective about imperialism that he can therefore abstractly make arguments about, right? Here, we are dealing with such a degraded, we're having a very, very degraded conversation because we don't have a standpoint, right? The conversation we're having is not the stuff. Obviously when Clint was talking about platypus panels, that's a little different. I should say the thing that I said is very degraded because it's I'm gesturing and pointing at random smoke signals and I'm sort of trying to feel around and I'm trying to share with you guys the sense of what I kind of think is happening in the world, right? But we can't actually so what I'm just trying to say is we're not critiquing imperialism, obviously. We're just looking at various things underneath the surface, and then maybe at best what we can do is negatively oppose left discourse on Europe and left discourse on state power, maybe, if that.
Okay, shall we wrap it up? Yeah, so thanks a lot.
One more announcement is on July 20th, you guys are all welcome to come to London because Lisa, I, and some other members of Platypus are hosting a panel, actually kind of related to Niels's question, where we are going to be featuring speakers who consider themselves post-left. And they're people who are trying to be relevant in capitalist politics, and they're making a bid to be a part of reconstituting they're making a bid to be a part of constituting post-neoliberalism, and they're all from the European perspective. So we're going to have one guy from Sweden, one person from Germany, hopefully, and then two people from the UK.
Yeah, so the guy from Germany is Georg Kurz. He's the KPÖ member that recently joined Die Linke, and he's very influential in reforming Die Linke at the moment. However this is gonna end, or what this prospect of this project is, and also the Swedish speaker is kind of a similar political project as the Sarah Wagenknecht party is here in Germany. So we try to capture, so all these phenomena don't happen only in Germany, they are all over the world in 2 different times. And we are trying to bring these people together to have a talk about the question, what is the concept of the left today?
Like this guy, Georg Kurz, is exactly the one I was talking about when I was saying, talking about the full circle yesterday. He used to be in the Young Greens, and he left the Young Greens, joined Die Linke, and became like the KPÖ spokesperson in Die Linke.
Yeah. And if you guys can come to London, that would be awesome. But if you can't, it'd be really cool if you guys, if you do a watch party or something like that of the panel here, reflect on it, we can have a kind of international discussion about it. Because it is like this moment. And it's only European, like we only have European speakers, right? We don't have American speakers. It's really like, this is a very interesting moment for European mainstream politics, obviously.